Have you ever heard of a king who was treated with exorcisms instead of medicine, who was considered a miracle just for being able to breathe, but who, at the same time, carried the ruin of an empire in his entire body? Well, this isn't just any story. It's the true story of Charles II, the King of Spain who was born to die. Literally. And if you think you've seen decadent kingdoms, prepare to meet the sickest throne in Europe. By the way, before we continue, have you subscribed to the channel? Because here we go deep where others only skim. Like, comment below and share this video with anyone who loves a good true story, the kind you never heard in school. Charles wasn't just a sick king. He was the result of centuries of genetic pride, intermarriage, and disastrous political decisions. While other children learned to lead, he was hidden away as if he were a stain on the royal record. But the most bizarre thing, even with his body failing, his signature still moved armies, and his death ignited a war. Curious? Then settle in, because what you're about to see is an unfiltered dive into the life of a king who should never have reigned, but who forever changed the fate of Europe. Few people know, but not every king lives like a king. Charles II, for example, carried a crown too heavy even for the shoulders of an empire. Imagine being born with your destiny already set, with a throne waiting for you, but without the physical, mental, or emotional preparation to rule. The curious thing is that, even surrounded by luxury, he was a prisoner of his own lineage. And this speaks volumes about how certain privileges can be well-disguised traps. Sometimes the greatest weight isn't responsibility, it's blood. This is where the plot twist begins. And it's no soap opera. Charles II was the last of the Habsburg dynasty to rule Spain, a lineage that seemed immortal. But like every castle built without a firm foundation, the time came for it to crumble. Charles inherited more than a throne. He also inherited the exhaustion of a dynasty that abused consanguinity as if it was state policy. And this is no exaggeration. These were marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, all to keep the blood pure. When we think of royalty, our minds go straight to glamour, crowns, banquets, palaces. But what few people realize is that behind the velvet curtains lived a young king who was frail, sick, lonely, and manipulated. Charles II was king on paper, but a pawn on the board. He had no say in decisions, no health to impose his presence, and was surrounded by advisors who used his weakness as political fodder. A sad and real scene. The end of his reign was not just the end of a name, but the end of an era. The Spanish monarchy was in tatters, and the empire, once the most powerful on the planet, was now stumbling. Charles's death wasn't just biological. It was symbolic, a sick body ending a sick empire, and if you think the worst is yet to come, hold on tight, because what lurked behind this story is far more sinister. Charles II was born a walking enigma. Even before he could utter a word, his body bore the weight of centuries of family decisions that ignored biological logic. The Habsburgs, obsessed with maintaining power among their own, created a web of intermarriage that gradually defied natural laws. And the result? A baby with a fragile appearance, precarious health, and genetics almost begging for help. Have you ever heard the expression "blood runs thick"? Well, here it was. Charles's father was his own wife's uncle, and this was nothing new among the Habsburgs. For generations they repeated this pattern, as if playing with fire without realizing they were feeding the genetic time bomb. Kingship, which should have been a symbol of strength and leadership, became associated with physical deformities, infertility, and mysterious illnesses. The court knew, but they remained silent. Imagine growing up being called a miracle, not for extraordinary feats, but simply for being alive. Charles II faced constant infections, difficulty walking, speaking and learning. It was as if time was moving faster than he was. While the other princes rode and studied, Charles was protected from the wind, the dust and the stairs. All in the name of a secret that royalty preferred to hide under the marble carpet. And don't think this was taken for granted. There was fear. There was shame. And there was also something no one said out loud, the suspicion that the king was a living symbol that the empire no longer had room to grow. Charles's birth, far from being celebrated, was treated with almost morbid caution. And if you think the drama ends there, don't worry, because this lineage would face even more bitter consequences than anyone imagined. Charles II's face was almost a metaphor for the empire he ruled. A beauty distorted by excess, carelessness, and blind pride. His features weren't just different, they were striking, symbolic. The exaggeratedly projecting yo, the sad, wide-set eyes, the difficulty chewing or speaking, all of this revealed more than a health problem. It was the portrait of a lineage that refused to heed nature's warnings. Habsburg jaw was just the tip of the iceberg. Charles suffered from neurological, hormonal, digestive and reproductive problems. In the eyes of modern science, his body was a collection of syndromes, but at the time it was seen as a curse, divine punishment, or even, and this was common, the work of witchcraft. After all, how to explain a king who couldn't eat properly or hold a coherent conversation? The people needed answers and created their own. There's a curious and uncomfortable detail. Despite everything, Charles II's appearance was considered worthy for royal portraits. Court painters did everything they could to soften his features, paint youth where there was weariness, firmness where there was weakness. Doesn't this remind us a bit of what we do today on social media? We show what's beautiful and hide what's uncomfortable. But in Charles's case, hiding didn't solve anything. It was just makeup over ruins. Even with all his effort to appear normal, the king's body betrayed the truth no one wanted to admit. The monarchy was rotten from within. Genetic degeneration was merely the physical manifestation of a sick political system, closed in on itself, deprived of oxygen, and lacking renewal. And when the body begins to fail, sooner or later the soul follows. But Charles still had to face what would come next, a childhood far from worthy of a king. Charles II's childhood wasn't filled with playing in gardens or running through palace corridors. It was filled with silence, whispered prayers, and worried looks. From his earliest years, the boy's extreme frailty became a source of despair at court. Any fever was considered a sign of the end. And given the impotence of medicine at the time, do you know what they did? They appealed to the invisible. Blessings, candles, prayers, and even exorcisms. Yes, you read that right. Charles underwent exorcisms as a child. It was believed his problems were the work of the devil or the result of witchcraft cast by enemies of the crown. And, let's be honest, that wasn't uncommon back then. The line between faith and superstition was as thin as a hair, and doctors often gave way to priests and healers. A king in the making, but treated like a possessed body. Can you imagine how crazy that is? The palace became a kind of ritual temple, where people tried to save both soul and body at the same time. One day, they placed sacred relics under his pillow. The next, they took him to touch miraculous images. The boy's fragile body became a battleground between science, faith, and fear. And the saddest part, he grew up believing he was indeed cursed, that everything wrong he felt was the fault of something greater, something he couldn't control. While other noble children learned to wield swords or debate philosophy, Charles learned to survive. Each day alive was treated as a new miracle, fueling the idea that he was chosen by God or by occult forces. But no one thought of preparing him to truly be king. It was as if everyone knew that Deep down, that throne was no longer meant to rule. But fate had even more ironic plans for the young sovereign. While kings of the past were molded from an early age for leadership, with teachers, advisors, and sham wars, Charles II was kept on the margins almost as if he were made of glass. His tutors, chosen more for their loyalty to the crown than their competence, treated him with excessive zeal and a lack of expectation. It was like teaching someone to swim without ever leaving the edge of the pool, and this, of course, exacted a heavy price. Charles grew up without the tools to govern. The environment around him was suffocating. The court preferred to hide him away rather than educate him. Fear of scandal, fear of revolt, fear of facing the truth. Many accounts of the time describe Charles as apathetic, slow, struggling even to understand simple instructions. But was he this way by nature or by neglect? Children learn with stimulation, with challenge, with exposure. He, on the other hand, was deprived of all this, trapped within a gilded dome. Some people believe ignorance is a blessing, but in the case of a king, it becomes a curse. Charles spent his youth surrounded by sycophants, religious fanatics, and self-serving advisors. Politics, strategy, and ethics were not taught, only obedience and submission. The question remains, was this the court's stupidity or an intentional plan to keep the king weak and manipulable? The truth is, no one there wanted to lose their power. And just look at the irony. The more isolated he became, the more powerful those around him became. Charles, who should have commanded, was being commanded. A throne laden with gold, supported by pillars of sand, and all of this bubble created around him, prevented him from understanding the gravity of what was to come. Because what seemed like a sheltered childhood was actually paving the way for a silent and tragic reign. The crown was on Charles II's head, but the scepter was never in his hands. Since he assumed the throne as a boy, his reign was piloted by figures who circled power like vultures, circling defenseless prey. First, his mother, Queen Regent Marianne of Austria, who controlled everything from behind the scenes. Then came ministers, priests, nobles, all with one hand on the throne and the other in their own pockets. Charles was, in essence, a royal puppet. It's hard to imagine a king who signed decrees without understanding what they said. But that was routine. Many documents were explained vaguely or weren't even read by him. It was like giving a blind man the reins of a burning chariot. And the most intriguing part, the people, for the most part, were unaware of the extent of this manipulation. They saw the king as a divine figure, when in reality he was a ventriloquist dummy for an elite disguised as advisors. The Spanish court became an arena of internal disputes, with each group trying to get closer to the king and shape decisions in their favor. And Charles, naive, sickly, and poorly educated, had no way of discerning interests. One day he was advised by conservative clerics, the next by corrupt nobles with foreign alliances. Whoever controlled Charles controlled Spain, and the most frightening thing, this dynamic wasn't a secret, it was a strategy. It was like watching a puppet dance on a minefield, and each misstep pushed the country closer to collapse. But Charles didn't even notice. He lived in a palace where everyone smiled on the outside and plotted on the inside. And it's precisely at this point in the story that things begin to take on tragic overtones. Because, weak as he was, the king was still a symbol. And when the symbol begins to crumble, the entire empire trembles with it. In the monarchy, producing an heir is more than tradition. It's an obligation. It's the line that keeps power flowing from generation to generation. But Charles II, despite marrying twice, never managed to fulfill this mission. His marriages, though celebrated with pomp and promise, ended in frustration and silence. There were no children, and with each passing year, doubt turned to despair. Who would inherit the Spanish throne? This infertility, more than a biological problem, became a political earthquake. Without a clear successor, the European powers began to sniff out an opportunity. France, Austria, England. Everyone knew that if Charles died childless, the succession would become an international auction. And as if that weren't enough, rumors began to surface that the king was in fact impotent, and these rumors corroded his authority like acid corrodes metal. The court, of course, tried to cover up the situation. They blamed their wives, fate, even occult forces. It was easier to invent a witch than to admit that the king, the ultimate symbol of virility and continuity, could not fulfill his most basic role. And this caused the pressure on him to grow like an ever-densifying shadow. Each failed attempt to produce an heir was another nail in the coffin of the Habsburg dynasty. This childlessness left Spain in a state of perpetual suspense. The people feared chaos, the nobles conspired, and enemies armed themselves. Charles, already physically frail, was now also emotionally devastated. How could he rule an empire if even the continuation of his lineage was impossible? And how could he cope with the weight of failure when the entire world expected him to be eternal? Spoiler: this void in the line of succession would provoke a shock Europe would never forget. During his lifetime, King Charles II's doctors were at odds with each other in a mixture of perplexity and superstition. Medicine at the time was still in its infancy, and diagnoses often bordered on the mystical. But there was one thing everyone noticed. The king's body simply wasn't functioning as it should. Vomiting spells, extreme weakness, episodes of hallucinations. Everything was recorded in reports that today give us clues as to what was really happening inside that broken body. But it was after his death that the truth shocked the world. The king's autopsy became a kind of macabre account of all that inbreeding had wrought. According to the records, his body contained not a drop of blood. His intestines were gangrenous, he had only one testicle atrophied, and his skull was filled with water. It sounds like fiction, but it's a true story. It was as if Charles's body were a genetic warning capsule sent to the future. These accounts became legends in the halls of European history. And more than fueling astonishment, they served as a symbol of the end of a sick lineage. The king's body, instead of being cremated or buried with immediate honor, was studied, commented on, and debated. All of Europe wanted to understand how such a powerful empire had been guided until its last breath by a man in such pitiful conditions. And the answer was simple and cruel: blindness to power. The curious thing is that, even with so much physical evidence of the collapse, many at the time still insisted on looking for external culprits. Witches, enemies, curses. No one wanted to accept that the end was the result of internal choices made generation after generation. But this denial, as you will see, didn't prevent the consequences from exploding, because Charles's death, far from solving the problem, was the trigger for one of the most significant wars in modern Europe. When Charles II died, the Spanish crown didn't simply pass to a successor. It exploded like a political grenade. The king left no children, no direct heirs, only a controversial will naming the Duke of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France, as the new sovereign. And then, my friend, the powder keg lit by your infertility finally exploded. The Spanish throne became a subject of dispute between the greatest powers in Europe. The War of Spanish Succession was more than a dispute over territory. It was a direct reflection of Spain's internal fragility, shaped by centuries of miscalculated inheritance decisions. France and Austria clashed furiously, while England, Portugal, and the Netherlands joined the fray to ensure they weren't left out of the division. It was as if the entire continent were playing chess, with the Spanish crown as the prize and the dead king as the main piece on the board. The most tragic part: If Charles had had a healthy son, none of this would have happened. But the absence of a legitimate successor left a power vacuum no one wanted to fill. The war lasted more than a decade, claiming thousands of lives, ruining economies, and redrawing the political map of Europe. All this because of a weakened body, heir to an empire that had forgotten how to renew itself. As they say, when the center falls, everything around it shakes. And so, the dead king's body became a living weapon in the hands of the living. The battles that followed showed that Charles II's legacy wasn't just biological or symbolic, it was explosive. The silence of his life became the roar of a war. But if you think the tragedy ended there, brace yourself. Because the medical mysteries surrounding the king would continue to baffle scholars for centuries. For centuries, Charles II's body and behavior fueled theories, doubts, and medical speculation. After all, how could so many anomalies in a single individual be explained? At the time, without the resources of modern genetics, doctors were lost in superstitious diagnoses and imprecise conjectures. Some spoke of a curse, others of possession. But the truth was far more scientific and, curiously, more frightening too. With advances in genetics in the 20th century, researchers began to hypothesize based on documented symptoms. The most widely accepted hypothesis that Carlos suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal condition that affects males and can cause infertility, feminine traits, and incomplete development. Another theory points to aciduria or taric acid type Y, a rare disease that compromises metabolism and may explain its appearance, muscle weakness, and neurological crises. Habsburg genealogy was then re-examined through a new lens. Successive inbreeding not only increased the risk of rare diseases, it virtually guaranteed that something would go wrong. One study even concluded that Charles had a 25% chance of inheriting recessive mutations, a staggeringly high number. In other words, he wasn't a miracle, as they claimed. It was pure statistics, and a tragic one. And look how interesting. The case of Charles II has become an academic reference. To this day, students of medicine, genetics, and history study his case as a classic example of how politics and biology can collide catastrophically. But even with clearer scientific explanations, the fascination surrounding him remains. Because the question that never stops is, if the doctors of the time had known what we know today, would Spain's fate have been different? If there was anything stronger than the nobility in Charles II's Spain, it was the power of the church. And we're not talking about personal faith, but about a system that dictated norms, controlled political decisions, and even shaped the behavior of royalty. Charles was deeply religious, almost obsessive. He never made decisions without first consulting priests or holding masses. It was as if, at every step, he needed divine approval. And this, of course, opened the way for heavy-handed manipulation. The Inquisition, still active at the time, had its eyes on everything, including inside the palace. All it took was for someone to suggest that an illness was caused by the devil or witchcraft, and that was it. Interrogations, torture, and burnings at the stake would begin. Charles, frail and easily influenced, was easy prey to this environment. He firmly believed his suffering was a punishment from heaven or the work of hidden enemies, and so state decisions often became entangled with spiritual beliefs. This alliance between throne and altar created a climate of fear and paralysis. Instead of consulting foreign doctors or modern scientists, as was already practiced in parts of Europe, the court preferred to light candles, hold processions, or perform exorcisms. Science was viewed with suspicion, doubt, with sin. And this kept Charles's reign stuck in the past, while the world moved toward modernity. The king went so far as to allow the Inquisition to investigate those close to him. He saw allies disappear, courtiers condemned for witchcraft, and even members of his own family faced suspicion. It was as if the fear of God had become a political weapon. But deep down, there was a leadership vacuum, and that vacuum needed to be filled with anything, even the fire of intolerance. But the king's spiritual instability wasn't the only problem lurking. Charles II's body spoke for him, even when he said nothing. It was frail, deformed, weakened, and this, in itself, carried a brutal symbolic weight. Imagine an empire that once dominated the world, now represented by a man who could barely walk alone. For many, he was the physical mirror of what Spain had become, an aging, tired and invigorated powerhouse, mired in the past. Artists and chroniclers of the time tried to soften this image. Official portraits depicted a dignified, majestic, even healthy king. But anyone who saw Charles up close knew this was an illusion. He was a walking symbol of decline, and everyone sensed it in the air. His body no longer inspired respect, it inspired pity or fear. And in an era when the king represented the strength of the state, this physical fragility had a devastating impact on the nation's morale. There was also an almost mystical element surrounding him. Many believed Charles was a sort of royal martyr figure, destined to suffer for the sins of the dynasty. With each health crisis, collective prayers, religious vows, and promises of pilgrimage arose. But in practice, this commotion only revealed how lost the people were. They sought signs in the heavens because there was no leadership on earth, and an empire without direction slowly. Charles was the sick body of a sick country, and even if no one said it out loud, everyone knew it. He was the royal elephant in the throne room. Every weary look, every groan of pain, every public absence was further confirmation that the end was near. And in this charged scenario, even small gestures became signals, as if the lift of a finger could shake the fate of an entire empire. But tension would only increase as court intrigues began to boil. If Charles II's body was fragile, the environment around him was poisonous. The Spanish court became a snake pit, where every gesture was a ploy, every word a trap. With such a vulnerable king, the backstage of power became a stage for almost theatrical intrigues. One day, the queen was suspected of witchcraft. The next, an advisor was accused of poisoning. And in the midst of it all, Charles, lost, unsure of whom to trust. The king's second wife, Marianne of Neuburg, was the subject of many of these rumors. Because she couldn't get pregnant, which of course was attributed to her, not the king's condition. Rumors began to surface that she was casting spells, using potions, or having affairs with wizards. Today it seems absurd, but back then, a single well-spread rumor was enough to be taken to the Inquisition. And the longer time passed without an heir, the more heated the situation became. Charles, influenced by everything and everyone, began to suspect even his own shadow. He even ordered internal investigations, dismissed members of the court, and in moments of intense crisis, accepted spiritual practices that bordered on the surreal. Once he allowed a monk to perform a kind of spiritual cleansing ritual in the royal chambers. It was desperation disguised as devotion. While the king sought invisible solutions, the throne sank into the visible mire of politics. The tension was so great that even small gestures could trigger crises. An exchanged glance, an unauthorized visit, an intercepted letter, anything could turn into a scandal. And in this paranoid scenario, real issues, such as the administration of the empire or the succession, were overlooked. It was a reign trapped by phantoms, some created by the imagination, others very real. And amidst this chaos, the most decisive moment approached. The will that would change the course of history. Charles II spent his life being manipulated, and ironically, it was at his greatest moment of power that he made his most controversial decision. On his deathbed, Weakened, pressured from all sides, and surrounded by interested voices, the king drafted a will that would fall like a bombshell across Europe. He named the Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor, a choice that in effect handed the Spanish crown to the rival branch of the Bourbon dynasty. The decision, of course, was not accepted without resistance. The House of Habsburg, which reigned in Austria, felt betrayed. After all, if anyone should inherit the Spanish throne, it was a Habsburg. But Charles, influenced by French advisors, his wife, and perhaps even by a hope of securing peace, chose a different path. And with this gesture, he sealed not only his fate, but that of the entire continent. A simple piece of paper became the trigger for a war of epic proportions. It's curious to think how a man so sick, discredited and considered by many to be incapable, able to make a decision with such historical impact. And perhaps this is the paradox. His physical frailty didn't stop him from irreversibly changing the European political landscape. His choice of a Bourbon was seen as treason by some, as strategy by others, and as madness by many. But regardless of opinion, the fact is that he turned the tables on the final move. The will was read in Madrid, and within days, news spread throughout the kingdoms. Some celebrated, others armed themselves. It was the beginning of a new era, but also the beginning of a new conflict because, as you can imagine, when national interest, dynastic egos and fragile alliances collide, what follows is fire, blood, and a fight for the throne. And all of this only shows us how the king's silence concealed a storm ready to erupt. Charles II died as he lived, shrouded in silence, doubt and speculation. For a long time, the true extent of his condition was hidden. The court, the ambassadors, even the chroniclers, all avoided speaking openly about what was really happening to the king, his weakened body, his illnesses, his limitations. Everything was treated as a state secret. It was safer to maintain the illusion than to face the empire's fragility. And this silence spanned the centuries. Only with the advancement of genetics and modern medicine did researchers begin to piece together the puzzle of Charles II's life. Based on portraits, letters, medical records, and genealogy, it was discovered that he was a direct victim of political decisions based on pride and superstition. His body, once seen as a divine failure, came to be interpreted as a historical warning, a familial engineering error. But perhaps most symbolic of all is the way his legacy was built, by absence. Charles II was not marked by great deeds, epic battles, or memorable speeches. His name echoes for everything he failed to achieve, and this, as painful as it may seem, is a powerful legacy, because it forces us to look at what we ignore, to reflect on the cost of hiding our failures behind pomp and outdated traditions. Today, when studying the end of the Habsburg dynasty, Charles II is remembered as the culmination of a lineage that defied biology with politics. His body carried the secrets of centuries, and these secrets, once revealed, show us what happens when power insists on perpetuating itself without renewing itself. But has this legacy truly been lost to time, or does it still echo to this day in silent decisions that shape the destiny of entire nations? And now tell me, how many times in your life have you ignored a small problem, thinking it wouldn't get any worse? The story of Charles II is more than a curious chapter in European monarchy. It's a cruel mirror of everything we avoid facing: pride, stubbornness, carelessness, and the belief that power is immortal. But the body doesn't lie, and when a king's body breaks down, the truth emerges, belatedly. But it does emerge. Could it be that you too have something hidden under the rug of your history? Some habit, some belief, some family tradition that's been repeating itself and weakening you without you realizing it, because ultimately, what made an entire empire sick was precisely the insistence on holding on to what no longer served. And the question remains, what are you holding on to inside that you should have left behind? If you enjoyed this deep and far from obvious dive into the life of a king who was a victim of his own lineage, comment below what surprised you most about this story. Share it with someone who also loves to understand the dark underbelly of history. And of course, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and don't miss the next videos, because what we deliver here isn't shallow content, it's knowledge with purpose. And now that you know Charles II's secret, I ask you, how long will you continue feeding yours?